Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lori Casey. Dr. Frank Tuitt is the Associate Provost for Inclusive Excellence at the University of Denver. Dr. Tuitt is a scholar devoted to the examination of topics related to access and equality in higher education. He's a guest speaker at Eastern Illinois University today, and he took time out to visit with us. So we want to thank the Office of Civil Rights and Diversity and the Office of the President for sponsoring Dr. Tuitt and helping to coordinate this interview for us. Dr. Tuitt, thanks and welcome to Eastern.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about your background. I understand you were born in London.
Yeah. So my parents met in London. My mom was in nursing school. My dad left the Caribbean island called Antigua to, start a career in London, and I was created out of that union. And they moved to the U.S. in 1969. Mm-hmm. Like most immigrant families at that time, they came to try to create a better opportunity for their kids. And for the most part, they've been pretty successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we'll jump forward several years. Tell us about your journey in higher education and how you came to the University of Denver.
It's interesting. I began my introduction this morning by talking a little bit about how 30 years ago I arrived, actually 31 years ago, I arrived at Connecticut College in New London, Connecticut. And I went to Connecticut College because I had visited it earlier in the year, and it was a vibrant, dynamic, diverse environment. They had prospective students, they had alumni who had come back for one of the celebrations, and so I was like, this is where I'm going to school. And I got there in the fall, and my first reaction was, where did everybody go? So I ended up being one of 3 African Americans in my class, African American males, one of 10 African American males in the entire school. And so, I went into an environment that I found to be at first culturally and socially and intellectually isolating. And my work in terms of thinking about diversity issues in higher ed began then. I was a very active student, was the president of the Black Student Union my sophomore year, and I remember how that came to be. There were a group of us, the 10 students of color who were in my class. We were sitting in one of the dorm rooms earlier that year, and we were all talking about how we were going to transfer. And at some point we said, well, you can transfer, but the challenges are going to be the same wherever else we go. And so at that point, we made a commitment to get involved and take on leadership positions. And from there on, I got involved and ended up engaging in some campus activism. My junior year, we took over the administration building and asked them to make the college much more diverse. And so we asked for courses on African American studies. We asked for more resources for our multicultural center. We asked for sensitivity training for the faculty and staff. And we asked for a commitment to increase the diversity of faculty, staff, and students. And at the end of that 19 and a half hour takeover, we had a commitment from the university, from the college to do those things. And, you go full circle almost exactly 20 years later, and I ended up on the board of trustees at Connecticut College.
So you did graduate.
I did graduate. Okay. I didn't get arrested for being involved in campus activism. Graduated, left there, and knew upon leaving that I was ready to work in a higher ed institution. And the positions I took after that have all been on college campuses. Been on a college campus for the last 31 years.
So that idea for for racial equality and diversity in the classroom started with you personally.
Absolutely.
And it's really taken off. Tell us about your role at the University of Denver.
So I am the Associate Provost for Inclusive Excellence, and in that role I have the privilege of working with colleagues across campus, and in particular my staff in the Center for Multicultural Excellence, focusing on ways in which we can make the university close the gap between its aspirations to be an inclusive and affirming campus environment for all students and where we are in reality. And so we work with a variety of stakeholders. We provide campus programs. We offer training for faculty and staff and students. We're engaged in a lot of work in the community as well, working with historically underrepresented students and trying to get them or help them view college as a reality, not just University of Denver, but any college. And so last Friday, for example, we had about 150 African-American male 8th and 9th graders on campus for our Black Males Initiative Summit. And that program is just one example of a program where we're trying to increase diversity in terms of the pipeline.
So when did we start to see more diversity in the classroom in higher education?
Well, I think it's always been there. It's just more recently we've seen, because of demographic changes, a significant increase in the number of diverse students arriving on our campuses. And so, but diversity has always been there, I think. Yeah, just a significant increase in access to post-secondary ed has brought it to the forefront.
In your research and in talking to people, what do you think is the biggest challenge when it comes to diversity in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a very complex question, but one thing I will say is that we unfortunately have, while we've made some progress, by and large we still continue to teach in the ways that we did when our institutions were less diverse. And so we're using the same pedagogical practices and learning
explain what that is if people aren't real familiar with that.
So it's simply teaching and learning practices that we used 20 and 30 years ago. Unfortunately, I would think that I believe the majority of faculty members today teach in the same manner that they were taught, right? And so we have this cycle where traditional teaching practices get repeated, and so the increased diversity that's arriving in our classrooms have challenged us to rethink how we engage in teaching and learning, and I think has created some tremendous opportunities for us to meet the challenge of educating an increasingly diverse nation.
So what do you, when you talk to groups, what are some things that you're saying to those people that, whether it's faculty members, students, things that need to change to move us to where we need to go?
So let me try to give you a 90-minute presentation in a couple of sentences. One, I think what's important for faculty members is to really think about how the diversity in their classrooms is creating new opportunities for growth around teaching and learning. And so just thinking about that, engaging in what does it mean for the types of examples I use, what does it mean for the activities that I use, what does it mean for the stories that I tell, the problems that I use, the case studies that I choose. It's really thinking about how diversity might matter in the decisions we make as we're designing our courses. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think faculty members need to think about who they are as instructors and how other individuals might perceive them based on their prior experiences or their experiences with them. That, because the demographics are changing in significant ways, the opportunity for people to interact across diverse groups is surprisingly still not as significant as we would like. And so we have, in my case, I'm teaching students who for the first time are coming in contact with an African-American male, right? And these students may have had pre-K, K through 12, 4 years of undergraduates in my case, undergraduate education, and even 2 years in a graduate program. And so they're in their doctoral studies with me, and for the first time having a African-American male as an instructor.
And I would think that for some of our students here at Eastern, they probably went to school, K-12, in a primarily white school, and then they come to a place like Eastern where you have African-American students, international students. it can be a real eye-opener. But it can be also very enriching, too, to be in class with someone that doesn't come from the same racial background that you come from.
It's an amazing opportunity. The challenge is that we just can't simply assume because they're in the class together that they're going to maximize and leverage the diversity that's there. And so we have to be intentional about how we extract those benefits. And so that's the challenge that we're facing.
Do you find in your research that faculty maybe say, well, this is the way I teach. The students need to adapt to my method. I shouldn't have to adapt to theirs.
Absolutely. There are some folks who have worked hard to develop their craft, develop their approach. They have a method to the madness that they define as teaching, and it's worked over the years, and so why change? Unfortunately, we know through extensive body of research that all classrooms are not created equal, and students don't have the same opportunities for success. And so if we're truly committed to creating classroom environments where students can be the best that they can be, we have to adapt our teaching.
Well, and it's no different than adapting to new technologies.
Exactly.
And this generation of, you and I are probably closer to the same age than
Thank you.
Our cameraman is in his 20s. The way we were brought up and the way that we learned is a lot different. We didn't have computers and things when we were kids, so it is different.
Very different.
Yeah. So what is the message that you would give to someone, to the people that you're speaking to here at Eastern? What do you want them to come away with?
I think there are a couple of takeaways. One, that they can make a difference in the lives of the students that they're privileged to have in their classrooms. And it begins with really taking an effort to get to know their students on an individual basis. So that's one thing. Two, that our society is becoming much more diverse, and we have an obligation and a responsibility to prepare our students to be successful in an increasingly diverse society and nation. And what better place than the classroom to fulfill that responsibility? And then the third thing is that they can use a variety of best practices that allow them to create the kind of optimal learning environment I believe all faculty want.
What are some of those best practices?
There are a range of things. So there's a growing body of literature that speaks to both high impact practices, so creating opportunities for students to engage in learning communities, creating opportunities for students to make the education that they're receiving relevant and connected to who they are. Really opportunities to go from theory to practice and practice to theory. So those are some of the high impact practices. I think there's also best practices around making education culturally relevant. And so how do you allow students to bring aspects of who they are into the classroom and use those rich assets as ways to access the material, ways to engage in knowledge construction, ways to engage in impactful learning. Yeah.
How do you get, I teach a class here at Eastern, and I find, not in every class, but in some classes, you have a smaller group of African-American students in the class that I teach. They tend to, when you work in groups, they tend to work together, and the white students work in other groups. How can you, as a faculty member, get them to integrate a bit more?
It's interesting. I think about that a little differently. In my experience, it's been the white students who tend to group together, and as a result, African-American students end up grouping themselves together. And so this question about self-segregation versus forced segregation is an interesting one, and I think there are experiences that happen in the classroom that in some cases may lead African-American students to want to work together because of an assumption of a shared understanding of experiences and in search of support. So that's definitely the case. But I think we all through experience have come to learn that the ability to interact with diverse individuals enriches the learning process that much more. And so If there were more opportunities for all students to feel like they could engage in cross-cultural diversity, racial diversity, and leave that experience whole and in sort of affirming, supportive ways, we would see more of it. And the challenge is, how do we create those opportunities for that type of engagement in the classroom?
So, in addition to being the work that you do at the University of Denver, you're also a researcher, correct? Tell us about some of your research and how you go about it, or your areas.
So recently I've been engaged in research around campus climate, trying to understand how students, faculty, and staff understand the campus environment from their various standpoints. And so I've been invested in sort of using institutional data to try and drive change at the institutional level. And we've seen some success with that approach. Yeah.
So you publish research nationally?
I do.
Okay.
So, it's part of a requirement for my faculty status. But most recently, I just had a book that I was involved with come out. It's Contesting the Myth of a Postracial America, the Continued Significance of Race in U.S. Education. And I had the privilege of co-editing that book with Dr. Dorinda Carter Andrews at Michigan State University. And we wanted to bring together some perspectives from scholars across the country who were concerned about the shift to what some folks have been calling this idea of a post-racial America, that because we have an African-American president, race no longer matters. In the book, we try to point out that even though we have an African-American president, there are still disparities across racial groups that warrant our attention on race. And in the book, we lay out a variety of ways to think about that and engage our scholars around the country who have been doing research on this as well.
Let me ask you this. The last time we had someone in the studio who was actually part of the same speaker series that you're part of, he brought up that idea that because we have a black president, race is no longer an issue. And he disagreed. He said, we talk about it more than ever before. What is your point of view?
I absolutely agree with that. And I think, some of the challenges that the president has had is indicative of why race still matters. And, we tend to think about folks who have been able to achieve successes as an example of race not being a factor, but we also realize that there are many exceptions to the rule, and these folks are just exceptions, not the norm, and we need to get to a place where the idea of having a black president is not, something novel, right?
He's just a guy.
Yeah.
Just a man.
Right.
I'll ask you this last question. What does diversity mean to you?
So that's the great question. I tend to appreciate a more narrow definition of diversity. I think diversity has come to mean any and everything. And because of that, it's lost some significance as it relates to how we think about issues related to access and opportunity and privilege and essentially equity in education. And so diversity, to me, is simply about how do we create higher ed institutions where all students have the ability to be the best that they can be, regardless of their differences. In fact, their differences are used in a way that allows them to achieve excellence. And so diversity is this sort of process of using difference in a way that maximizes learning.
And to take those opportunities that we can have with other people, whether it's in the workplace or in the classroom, learning from someone else from a different cultural background, ethnic background, because it does make the experience so much richer.
Absolutely.
So in closing here, do you think we as a society are getting better at diversity? Do you think it's getting better? It
is getting better, but I also acknowledge that each new success creates new challenges for us. And so, the goal was to let's get more diverse students on campus. And some institutions have been successful at that. now, wow, we got to really think about what it means to have diverse students on campus, right? So it creates new opportunities for growth. And so I don't think we can ever rest, because every success that we make will create a new opportunity for growth. And if we pause, we end up losing the ground that we established. And so, yes, it's gotten better, but we can't rest.
It's a continuum.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Tuitt, thank you so much for coming over to WEIU today, and hope you enjoy your time here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.